Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Vedic Astrology Podcast. My name is Fiona Marks, and I'm inviting you today to join me on a journey, a conversation about the moon and the moon as a phenomenon in our life, something we can see in the sky, but perhaps also something that we can use to reflect on our lives, perhaps to set goals. And to help me in this journey, I've invited two of my friends and colleagues. I'm delighted to have Steven Jones back with me again. You may remember Steven, my astronomy buddy from season 2, episode 1. We recorded an episode called Astrology and Astronomy and Their Co-Evolution. We answered some questions that astrologers might have about astronomy. So, Steven, it's delightful to have you back. Thanks for being here again.
Always lovely to see you.
I also have with me Jenn Page from Self to System, who has developed a tool to help us observe and reflect on our experience with the moon. And Jenn, because you haven't been on the podcast before, can I invite you to share a little bit about your background and your connection with the moon and with astrology?
Yeah, I'm excited to be here as well. I really appreciate the invitation. So I really got into astrology over the time of the pandemic and thinking about what are some things that I'm interested in, but are on the edge of what my normal thought process is. And the astrology piece started coming up because I was really interested in astronomy before and the history and all those types of connections. And I love anything that is a different system or way of seeing the world and kind of these tools that can help us think more about what might be coming up for us intuitively and allowing us to make a judgment call of, okay, does this work for me? Doesn't this work for me? And that just gives us data. It gives us information about how things play together. So my background is in biological and physical sciences to start off with. I looked at the tracking behavior of blue crabs with my doctoral research. And so that was very goal-oriented behavior in a lot of ways. And so taking lots of pieces of information and trying to figure out how to reach a goal with all of that. And then I moved into education because that was really important for me of like, how do we understand things and communicate with each other and help students really find meaning in what they're doing and connections to the real world and give them the tools that they need to make their own interpretations in their own way in the world with the skills and kind of development that way. So I'm still in the field of education. Over the pandemic, I started looking at the astrology as a new tool to add to the toolbox and got connected with you, Fiona, through the Varshafal exploration of looking at our solar year and how the astronomical with the astrological.
And I'm excited because I have with me today two scientists, two science educators, and it's going to help me with the left brain and the right brain.
Left is generally tends to be slightly more analytical, slightly more systematic, list-based ways, and right brain tends to be a little bit more holistic, perhaps. But again, we're all a mixture of both. And you could argue that modern science is really, it's more a right-brained activity because you need a certain amount of imagination when you're developing sort of ideas and developing theories.
Exactly. And so in our conversation today, we might have some quite factual-based astronomy stuff to talk about. And then we might move also into some quite imaginative stuff as well. And I think that's beautiful because the moon in astrology is a symbol for our imagination. And as you say, Steven, all scientists have to imagine their theories first, and then we can go and gather some facts to test these hypotheses or test these ideas. But we are integrated. So let's begin with my invitation. Steven, the real reason that I invited you along today was that even I, as the amateur astronomer, can notice that the moon looks a little bit lower in the sky right now. As I walk my dog, the last walk of the evening, I'm always so happy if I get the chance to see the moon. If there's not too many clouds, I can see what's going on. And I have an awareness of where the moon rises. I have an awareness of where it would be at the zenith of the sky at the top when it's like a full moon. I can look high up and see it. And I've just been noticing that it seems to rise in a different place and it seems a bit lower.
Well, I think the fascinating element to this is that I was a little bit like, actually, I'm not sure. Which is, I don't know, one of the greatest statements in science. I was, a second, so what is going on here? I had to dig out and do a little bit of reading as well. I think fundamentally the problem with all of this is that it is very hard to visualize a three-dimensional system. And I know certainly within my teaching, when teaching astronomy, I've used pictures, but even pictures are sometimes of limited help because they're 2D. And then even if you're watching 3D animations, like on a video, then even that, in a sense, is still a two-dimensional projection. So you've almost got to stand inside these things. The first thing is to say, if you find it really hard to visualize, join the rest of us. It is incredibly hard to visualize, but I think there's almost a sense of sort of the important starting point is to realize what it is not. And I think we so much think of it as just this two-dimensional thing, or like a picture you read in a book, or it's a flat plane. And I think the biggest thing to recognize is that it is absolutely not that. And the fact that, again, we're on a sphere, and then, of course, during an Earth's rotation, our orientation of how we are presenting ourselves to the moon is actually changing. And so how the moon looks is changing. And so it is a very complex system. This whole 18.6 year cycle, I've got to say, I haven't come across. I have not heard about it.
And that's where astrologers or Vedic astrologers might be like, oh, we know about our 18.6 year cycle because the cycle of the nodes, the lunar nodes, is on that cycle as well. So that's a number that we would probably be like, oh, I know something about.
The 18.6 year, I suppose people naturally have a perception of how the sun moves in the sky. Actually, I'm going to completely take that back. I think a lot of people don't, actually. And if you say to people, where does the sun rise and where does it set? I think a lot of people will even have an issue going rises in the east and sets in the west. I'm not convinced how many people would even say that. Because people don't have a sense of north, south, east, west anymore, because people don't need that in their daily lives. So the fact that people might be able to say the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, but of course you might get that from some people. But then the fact that you'll then go, actually some days it actually more rises in the northeast or the southeast. And again, I think to most people that would be a surprise, because to those people who are not looking at the sky, and actually I think most of the time people are not looking at the sky. And on a daily basis, people's connection with the sky is probably less now than it has ever been.
Exactly. This is why I got you and Jenn together today, because her tool is about helping us look at the sky and the moon. And I think you're right that we are disconnected from these phenomena that are literally right out the window.
Of course, most people are living in towns and cities now with light pollution, which is a whole other issue. People are not linked and they do not really know what's going on in the sky. The fact I do have a sense of the sky, because I'm interested in astronomy, I know over the course of a year that the path which the sun takes across the sky changes. But again, the path which the sun is taking is changing because it is a complex three-dimensional system. And I suppose at this point we have to mention the ecliptic. The way that I was taught it and the way that I teach it as well is that you can fundamentally think of the ecliptic in two different ways. In that if we think about the Earth, which is in orbit around the sun, as the Earth orbits the sun, it effectively orbits it in a plane, if you like, a two-dimensional plane, and we could call that the ecliptic. So that is one way of thinking about it. And so in terms of an orbital system, that is rather useful, thinking of the Earth orbiting the sun in the ecliptic. And so then if we look at the other planets in the solar system, most of the planets are orbiting not on the ecliptic, but at angles close to it, within a few degrees. And most of the minor planets, objects in the Kuiper belt and such beyond Neptune. So that's one way of thinking about the ecliptic. If we look at the position of the sun against the background stars, which appear to be fixed, they are not truly fixed, but in a sense they do appear to be fixed. So during the course of a night, those stars, those constellations, asterisms, they move across the sky because the Earth is spinning on its axis. But generally, the relationship between those points of light, those stars, are fixed. So if we're watching the sun over the course of a year, and I guess we will need to talk about what a year is in a moment, as the sun moves across the background stars, then the sun's position against the background stars changes, not just daily, minutely, secondly, and it changes. And if you join up, if you like, you plot the position of the sun against the background constellations, the line that traces across the sky is the ecliptic. Because certainly within astronomy, we have the celestial sphere, and we talk about the celestial sphere almost like all these stars and planets and nebula are like painted up on the inside surface of the celestial sphere, and the celestial equator and zero right ascension, all the declination points. It is like we're back in with Ptolemy and we're in the geocentric. So we have a measurement system that looks at it that way. But then, of course, we have appreciation that over complex things are happening. Perception is the key here, of course. We were talking about the 23.5 degrees is the reason we have the seasons. So the fact that the Earth's axis of rotation, this imaginary line that you could put through the center of the Earth like you've got a globe. So that stick, if you like, that axis is at 23 degrees to the ecliptic. So the fact that we have this axis at 23.5 degrees is why during the course of a year, the passage of the Earth's orbit around the sun means that the path which the sun takes across the sky varies. And so we have the sun is higher in the sky in the summer. So I think people may have a sense of that. But then, of course, the moon does the same thing. So the moon is orbiting at about 5 degrees to the ecliptic. Again, I think because there was quite a big eclipse, solar eclipse recently, just because the path of totality went right across the US. But anyway, as the moon is orbiting the Earth, if everything was on just this flat plane that people would imagine, then we'd be getting eclipses every lunar month. But then the fact that the orientation of the moon's orbit is at 5 degrees to the ecliptic means you've got to wait for the Earth so the moon to line up. So the bit that actually I hadn't realized the 18.6 is that if you think about the orbit of the moon now and think of that as like a little record, a little disc, that sort of tilted 5 degrees to the ecliptic. So if you imagine this, the plane of the orbit of the moon, and we put a little stick at 90 degrees to that. So that again is pointing up at 5 degrees to the ecliptic. But that little stick, if you like, that sort of axis of the orbit of the moon is precessing. And that's precessing, and that's got the 18.6 years. So I was actually, and I hadn't realized that. So it was a quite nice learning experience for me. It's actually, it's quite fast actually. So the fact you've got 18.6 years precession, so the angle the moon is at, the 5 degrees stays the same, but the angle at which the axis is pointing is sweeping around like a spinning top or a gyroscope moving around. And so that then is shifting the path which the moon takes across the sky. And so that's how we end up with the sort of the maximum altitude of the moon across above the horizon is changing. And of course, when you get to these stationary points, which is another big thing in sort of astronomy, because we've just passed one of these points, I believe. I think we've back in May or something, wasn't it? So if we are constantly watching, if you like, the position of where the moon is rising or setting on the horizon, we will notice that is shifting during the course of the year and then over this 18.6 year cycle. And I think we've reached a maximum, haven't we? So it's the maximum amount which I think the angle between which the moon rises and sets. And so I think the precession thing is interesting because, as you were saying, the Earth is precessing, but the Earth precesses it's like 1,000 years.
Yeah, very slowly.
Precession of the Earth, but the moon is only 18.6. That's the rationale for it, but it's something which it's not easy to notice unless you're really going out of your way to watch it.
But hopefully the invitation now is out there to pop out as soon as you hear this episode, whatever night it is, go out and have a look, because I think it's quite perceivable. And Jenn, have you noticed the moon where you live?
Yeah, and I do. I love two things you said, Steven, talking about starting off saying with "I don't know" as being one of the most powerful phrases that we have in science, since there were things that I hadn't considered about why the moon would be lower in the sky and your connection to the tilt of the earth and with the sun and how that shifts, because people are normally more awake during the day to see that element of, okay, if you from your window every day are looking across the span of the year and being able to see where along the horizon the sun is actually coming up or where along the horizon it's setting, it can give you that sense of, okay, higher or lower in the sky, that element of it. And that really helped connect the two things with the moon for me that I hadn't considered or thought about before, of like its tilt being off of the ecliptic and causing similar pieces. So that was just fun. And I'll say also that it really hasn't been that many years where I've recognized that the moon even rises or sets at different points in the night. So when you were talking about what things people take for granted or don't actually know about the east-west of the sun rising and setting and whatnot, and how it might be a little more northeast or southeast or whatnot, it wasn't until I started paying attention even to the moon to recognize, oh, okay, so when it's the full moon, when I'm actually like super paying attention to it, that's when it's really doing the full arc of the night sky, when I would think of being like, oh, the moon's out all night, versus when it's, even though I knew the science behind why we had the reflection and what the relationship was to the moon or sun, for some reason that never translated to me thinking about the timing of the rising and the setting until I really started thinking about it and looking at it. So yes, I've noticed that it's lower in the sky. It just amazes me how many things are happening that unless you actually pay attention to them and really think about them, it becomes even more fascinating.
The thing is, I find the Metonic element, I find this more interesting because this sort of comes back again to the sense of time. And I find it utterly fascinating how we have used the sun as a way of measuring time and not the moon. But of course, you've got lots of cultures that are using the moon as a way to measure time. And there's an awful lot of sense in that. There is an awful lot of sense. But then if you're using the sun to measure time, and there's an awful lot of sense to that as well, but the two systems don't match.
So the moon, in some ways, it has a 27 sort of day cycle, but in other ways it's 29, because since the time that the last new moon was, the Earth has also orbited.
27.3 days is the orbital period, which is correct. But then, of course, because the Earth is orbiting the sun, it's 29.5 for that three-dimensional orientation to get that correct. So you've got in 1 year, 12.368 lunar months. Okay. So, and this is where the whole 19-year thing comes into it, because it just turns out that if you multiply it all up, it's so wonderful because actually 19 Earth years, or after 19 Earth years, you actually, the number of synodic or lunar months is 234.992 months. So it's almost an exact number of months. And you've got this sort of wonderful thing where, it just so happens that every 19 years, not exactly, it's close. Yeah. Every 19 years, you get this thing where the moon will be in exactly the same point in its lunar cycle on that particular calendar day, if we're measuring dates using the sun. And again, it's just down to orbital periods. And come back in a couple of million years and it won't be 19 years. The cycle will change again. And so whereas the 18.6 year cycle is very much fixed and the lunar standstill, that will happen at this point. If we decide to look at where the moon is tonight in its, in its phase on this day, then in 19 years time, it will be in the same phase. And it's just one of these nice little things. But the fact that it's close to 18.6, it is completely unrelated. So you have these interestingly connected things and then other things which are just sort of flukes. But where I'm interested in, this is where I've been fascinated to hear sort of Jenn's view on this, is that I, as an astronomer, I am interested in the mechanics of it. And I'm also interested in the historical nature of this as well. And that is also interesting. But I think the thing is that whereas it's the fact that I am taking notice Now, I take notice and view it in an astronomical way. But I guess there are other ways of viewing the moon and taking notice. And I suppose it's almost stick your head above the ground, look away from your phone for a moment, just watch what's happening in the world. And I suppose that's where I think there's something to learn from here.
When your comment about the time part too, and how fascinated you are with these different concepts of time, I was recognizing that's essentially part of why I got into the looking at the moon planning, because I work in a government environment and just in environments in general where we use a calendar month. Like everybody has these dated planners or diaries or whatnot that are based off of the 1st through the 30th or 31st or whatever. And the reorientation to this kind of sun cycle over and over again, and recognizing that there's also this lunar cycle that's going on. And all the things in my day get oriented towards the hours of the day in relation to the sun, the month, the year, the whatever. And it was actually making it harder for me to create my own personal plans and goals, because I kept mapping them onto the cycles that everybody else was operating on and expecting me to do things on with my work environment. And so I would default to my work is the most important thing, and the sun cycle is the most important thing. And it was the centric part of this is how we're measuring time and agreeing to move on together. And when I started paying more attention to the moon, this was actually back in my days as a director of education on an island off the coast of Maine. And so it was off the grid, 12 miles off the coast. So the light pollution went way down and you could really see this astronomical phenomenon a lot better. And we also were working with the kids in a tidal environment. So that connection to the moon of really having to pay attention to what part of the tidal cycle we were on for how high or low those tides were and at what point in the day they were happening. Because if you can have a great low tide in the middle of the night, but you don't want to have little kids running around in that low tide environment when you can't see them. And so it was mapping all of those things. We worked on moon cycles in a lot of ways to work with kids in the marine science environment. And when I started looking at it for personal time management, it took me out of the mindset of my work is the most important thing about me and what I need to prioritize, and helped me shift a little bit like, all right, if I do it on this other time scale, what could I prioritize on this time scale that I could cyclically come back to on a regular basis that is not based on the calendar year and the way that everybody else is doing their things? I basically put my own personal goal setting, like what do I want to do with my relationships and what do I want to do with my hobbies or my finances or whatever. I put that review cycle on the moon cycle because it shifted things enough all the time compared to your normal Sunday through Saturday work week that I didn't get into a rut where the work was always put as the most important and the first thing. So that's really that conception of time and how we do it traditionally versus these other ways of knowing about time or thinking about time is really how I got into thinking about these things and how we can, how I can use what, like you said, historically has been a really important source of information for cultures for a long period of time that we really don't do a lot with right now. And if I try to map my experience, map my goals, all those things onto a moon cycle provides a greater awareness, I think, of just the purpose, like being purposeful about on this cycle, I will be looking at things. And I've found that really helpful. What I've done in a variety of different formats is basically create a semicircle, a half circle that's divided into 30 different sections coming out from the center. And so it's like this radial sunburst design that allows me to track where I'm at in the full moon cycle. So the 30 sections allows me to look at a full from new moon all the way around to the next new moon cycle. But I've created spaces in that diagram that allow me to then also put down the day of the week or the calendar day, whether it's a Monday or it's the 3rd of December or whatever it is. And within all of that, I can track whatever I want to track in each one of those 30 sections. And that acknowledgement of there are these 30 different little divisions that are possible across this whole moon cycle, and that different stages across the moon cycle, I can have check-in points where I'm seeing whether or not the things that astrology is telling me is matching up with my personal experience, both predictively, like saying, okay, next week on Tuesday, this is what the astrology is coming up with for a story and narrative about how the world or how I will be affected by this day. And then retroactively too, going backwards and saying, okay, yesterday, this is what was supposed to be at play. Did that actually come to fruition? And I can do that really technically of saying really clearly that the moon square Neptune in Pisces or whatever it is. And I can also be like, all right, so it was a new moon in Sagittarius. What generally speaking is the energy that's associated with a new moon, and new moon being the dark moon, or that I have no moon showing in the sky really. And so that kind of like introspective, dark, not worried about putting a lot of energy out into the world type of feel to it. Okay, what does Sagittarius mean within the broader scope? And so those types of things can help me at a very base level look at a theme, and then say from an intuitive standpoint, just if I said to you, oh my gosh, oatmeal for breakfast is the best thing in the world. You might have a reaction to that where you're like, holy cow, no, eggs, toast, warm things. What are you talking about? But by me giving you that, this is my opinion or my thought process of this is my truth, you have a reaction to what that truth is that tells you something about yourself of, no, oatmeal is not my thing. Glad it's her thing. That's all right. And that's what I'm doing with my testing on the astrology the entire way along is, okay, it's telling me this. Am I having one of these like big reactions of, that was so not what my day was, and that does not relate at all? Or am I having one of those, I hadn't thought about it that way. Okay. If I go at it with the framing, I'm going into a big meeting tomorrow. If I'm going at it with the framing that the astrology is telling me it's a good day for me to really speak influentially, I might be more apt to look for opportunities in that meeting where I'm like, okay, how can I positively influence what we're working on right now? What could I say? How could I say it that helps? And so it's just it's a flavor, it's a thought, it's a experiment. Every time is like a little dose of data of, does this work? Doesn't this work from an external perspective? But also, I hadn't thought about that internally. And without looking at this piece of data, it wouldn't have come up. I wouldn't have recognized that this could be a way I could look at it or pay attention to it. So that's my flexible moon planning from the dial standpoint of being able to look at something that you care about over the course of the entire moon cycle and create moments of checking in with yourself that isn't on everybody else's quote unquote calendar, saying they say when you're supposed to do the thing. It's all right. I'm going to connect a little bit more with what's going on out in the world.
Jenn, I just want to ask a question about your picture there. So for the people who are actually watching it, so you've got this wonderful semicircle there. So you've got little squares next to the moon cycles. So are you like writing in there or coloring in maybe, or is that just aesthetic? Are you putting numbers there or something?
So you can color in, and I think that is a great, like when you're first trying to figure out what does this look like for my mood or the weather in the day and how that was affecting my mood or whatever it is. In that outer ring of the moon tracker, what I try and do is I'll put in the actual time related things as the rest of the world sees it. So it'll be today's July 21st and it's Sunday. So those two things would go in those boxes. I would be keeping track of the moon phase and when it changes from sign to sign in the middle rings, and in the center rings, sometimes I'll actually put in whatever the astronomical connection is of where is Pluto in the sky or where is whatever. And other times it will be like if I'm looking at my energy across the whole phase of the moon, I can create a color code that says that blue is lower energy, red is higher energy. And I can just create a beautifully colored diagram, but see when across the whole cycle, I might be more energetic or less energetic. And put a little note on top of the color that says, oh, today was the day I stayed in or I saw friends, or what other data do I want to collect that I think might be interesting to look at? I think that's the key thing is it could be when do I plant stuff in my garden and what happens to the thing in the garden that based on when I planted it, which is a lot more historically what we were seeing happen of when in the moon cycle do you plant seeds and then what happens with the resulting. So I tried to make it as flexible for myself as possible. And then each month I just am really paying attention to what kind of data do I want to collect this month?
I just desperately want to turn the chart into a graph, start plotting it. Yeah. Yes, you probably in yourself, haven't you, be your left brain. It's probably really appropriate for me just to mention at this point, whereas I personally don't use astrology and it is not something that I personally find useful for me. But I suppose as the years as I've gone over, I've become more and more aware that it is important for people to have some means of self-reflection. And it's sticking your head above the ground or whatever and looking and recognizing that things are changing externally, maybe internally. So I completely see how some people, and it was so interesting, Jenn, when you said something comes up from the chart or whatever, and it might be, oh, maybe that's something to think about or reflect upon. And I think anything that gives a prompt for people that have that form of self-reflection, I think can only be a good thing. I personally don't find it useful, but that doesn't mean that I don't think it can be useful. There are areas where astrology can go into certain things, which I think can be very unhelpful, but you could say that about any branch of human endeavor. And I've certainly done things like tracking my own mood as a self-care sort of thing. And I've number systemed over dates and times.
When I first started dabbling with astrology, honestly, like from the scientific standpoint, some of the stuff that you were talking about, Fiona, of being associated with the astrology as a scientific person or as maybe that stigma associated with it that doesn't necessarily need to be there because it really is, like you said, Steven, it doesn't matter what human endeavor we go into. There is always this continuum of helpful elements or challenging elements. It's not that anything that we get into is all helpful or all not helpful or all good or all bad. It's what elements are you taking? What are you using them for? And so that's why I keep looking at things as regardless of what it is, it's a tool, and how we use it is what provides the value to us as an individual or to other people. And I'm just laughing because like even your comments on the tracking, like I have so many bullet journal things where I'm like tracking my mood and different things during the day. And that element of self-study and self-reflection, as I've understood myself better, it helps me understand other people and relate to other people more as well. So I think that in the type of kind of polarizing world that we're in right now, the more things we can do to self-reflect and the more things we can do to have these conversations where we might not all agree on the same thing or how it's used or whatnot, but that we can see all the different points and the values and the ways of looking at something. There's so much value in that, and especially value in helping students be in that space of, I don't know, I'm willing to learn, I'm willing to listen and have those dialogues, which the IB curriculum is really good at, and you as an IB teacher are really good at. Those are so valuable for, I think, the world that we live in and how we interact as humans. across all these areas of difference.
I think on our conversation today, it's been really interesting to contrast the sun and the moon, which we've spoken about so much, the sun and the moon in this conversation. And in astrology, we allocate qualities like masculinity and consistency to the sun, and to being direct, to being externally focused. And to the moon, we allocate qualities like intuition and reflection and femininity, and looking at these different ways of monitoring our life. So we were talking about monitoring it through the calendar, the normal solar calendar with its months and its dates and its Mondays and Tuesdays. And yet when we take the opportunity to monitor it through the moon, which you've been experimenting with and which we looked at the template today, did you find that it naturally lends itself to more intuition or more openness to reflection versus doing a solar day calendar kind of method?
Part of the reason that I think it helps me with that reflection is that on a shorter time period than the sun, we see this change in light. And so we have a dark period and a light period back to a dark period. I am somebody who's been very perfectionistic, achievement oriented, I didn't always understand the concept of that fading and that cyclic. Okay, sometimes I need to put out more energy. Sometimes I need to rest, because our society tends to reward that outward facing, putting things out type of energy. And so the moon started as a self-imposed cycle of I'm going to do more at some points, and then I'm going to purposely not do as much at other points. And so instead of starting off as being oh, how do I feel at this point? It's no, gosh darn it. It is the new moon. It is dark. I'm going to force myself to slow the heck down. And so for whichever direction the influence is coming from, at this point, I now have more of these cycles in my time, and I put more value on the retreat time of not always being on go. And so I don't know, chicken egg type of philosophy, like which came first of which part is influencing what, but by continuing to come back to that cycle and reflecting at various points during the cycle and being purposeful about, okay, I need to have natural rhythms. I can't just be producing out there, interacting all the time. That's just been hugely valuable to me. And I've been able to map experiences onto that, as well as purposely plan experiences that way.
Wow. I'm mind blown by that. Now that I've heard that from you, I think that in my life, I experienced very much the ups and downs of life and the ups and downs of energy levels and enthusiasm. So the thought of consciously having to program that, hey, let's have some downtime, is just mind blowing to me. But isn't that interesting, helpful, amazing that our enthusiasm and our output, maybe it isn't supposed to be 100% every day, all day, 365 days a year. And some people are going to be more naturally in tune with an energy up and down cycle inside themselves and might like to use a solar method to be more consistent with their energy. And then some people are going to be naturally very consistent with their energy and maybe benefit from experimenting with the ebb and flow. Is there a way for people to contact you, Jenn, or if somebody's interested in monitoring the moon, is your template available? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I can definitely add stuff for Fiona to put in the show notes so that there's a direct contact. My email contact is just jenn@self2systems.com, JENN, 2 N's. And the types of tools that I've been talking about today for people to be able to download and interact with and learn more about in a variety of different ways. There's kind of entry level, quick, easy, blank templates for you to use. There are more colorful ones, all of those types of things. We'll have a link to that, and just also happy to connect with anybody around these types of, philosophical, how do we manage time? How do we think about ourselves? Any of those types of things. We'd love to connect. I really looking and talking with people about what's going on in their life, how they work, how they think, and then trying to think about what tools actually might should help. I don't think one tool, one person is necessarily the right fit because we also go through seasons and cycles of our own life, and what's going to work for us this month may not work at all for next month, whether it's you've got a new child in the household, you change jobs just as we age and our philosophy changes. Yes, there's the moon cycle planning, but then also some of the tools that I've got link the moon cycle with, okay, from a weekly, quarterly, annually type of thing. How do you look at your whole balance of your life and not just put all your energy into work, put some into work and some into family and some into finances or security or fun or whatever the pieces are. And even the idea of the bullet journaling system of like, how do you track the present and then mindfully think about the future? So whether it's my tools or other tools, it goes across all the different areas of life and what works best for people.
And that's a beautiful full circle moment, because that's actually how Jenn and I met, is that a friend of mine approached Jenn about developing a unique system, a reflection system and planning system. And that's how we connected then through that mutual friend. So you never know what might come of that. And I like that it's using a tried and true scientific method, isn't it? Observation is a very important part of being a scientist, is just noting down things. And this is what you're bringing in to, although it's this particular system that we're talking about on the podcast, because it's the Vedic Astrology Podcast.
Right.
We're talking about a moon system, but it's just bringing in that data analysis, looking for patterns, noting down something that I want to focus on. Like you suggested, might be energy level, or maybe it's your mood, or maybe it's what you eat each day, or exercise level, or anything. Whatever we put our attention to, that's what we can make decisions about or make observation stories about. And if we don't pay any attention to it, all of that information just passes on by. So we're using the skill of observation.
And recognizing it goes across all different disciplines and ways of thinking about it. Like whether you're a chef and the concept of mise en place, where you've got the all of the organization pieces and the awareness that goes into how do you run a kitchen effectively, efficiently, or whatever. There's data pieces that go into it. And then there's the system that you create that helps to move things smoothly. And it's the same thing for a teacher when you're thinking about lesson plans, and whether you're a little more experienced and fly by the seat of your pants in terms of, I've done this lesson a bunch of times and I will be able to roll into tomorrow and I'm good to go. Or you need to really plan things out minute by minute. Those types of things not only change with the environment that we have, but with the person and what else is going on. I think there's the, what do we track? How do we track it? And then how do you move beyond just tracking something and actually making meaning out of it or taking action from it? And all of those things have personalization and flexibility associated with them that are just, that's where you make it meaningful for you.
Yeah. And that's where people might like to work with you to develop their own unique system. Then all that is left for me is to thank you both so much for being generous with your time today and indulging my interest in the moon and what might be going on up there in the sky, and what I could also do to observe and use the moon as a goal setting or reflection setting tool. I really appreciate everything that you guys have contributed, and I can't wait till the next chance that all the three of us get together to be here on the Vedic Astrology Podcast again. All right.
Thank you very
guys.
much.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Thanks, everyone. We'll see you again soon, but bye for now.